Okay, so we're talking about writing informational essays, and in the beginning, we have to create an introduction that's effective. Okay? So in order to get started, we have to remember sometimes that it isn't the mountains ahead to climb that wear us out, it's the pebble that's in our shoe. And right now, the mountain is getting through this entire process and writing this entire paper. But the pebble in your shoe is not knowing exactly how to put it together, and that's what will cause frustration, and that's what will irritate you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through step by step exactly how to write an introduction, and for those of you that already made the attempt, congratulations. Let's see how close you got. So when you're writing an introduction, it's all about letting the reader know exactly what they can expect from their essay. When we're writing information, we don't want surprises. We need to know, the readers need to know what I'm going to read about. It can be very easy if you follow basic guidelines. So in other words, don't sweat the small stuff, okay? Now, the most important thing to understand about an introduction is that there are two sentences that are critical. The first sentence, the lead, and the thesis sentence, which is the last sentence. Let's talk about the first one. A good lead is everything. It is what will make the difference between the reader continuing on in your paper or putting it down and going to a different one. So you have to come up with a very interesting lead. Now in the writing process, that might be really hard to do cold. Cold means it's the very first thing I'm going to write on the paper. So oftentimes we put down just what comes into our head. We might write, the Klondike Gold Rush was a very important time in history. I always tell my students, it's a first draft. Don't worry about it. You can fix it later. After you write more of the paper, you may go, oh, wow, this might be a better way to start my paper. So if you need to write something down just to get something down on paper, I tell the kids to do one of two things. Tell you guys. Number one, in parentheses, write the word help after the sentence. That tells you, you got to go back and fix it. It tells me that you're still working on it. So I won't make a whole lot of comments in your feedback other than I already know you want to fix this. Or you can change the font color. The font color helps because it's going to tell you I need to go back and revise this sentence, but it doesn't help me when I print them in black and white. So keep that in mind. So think about what you found in your research that you thought was very interesting. This can be done with an anecdote. An anecdote is a very brief, like 2-sentence story that's told. A statistic, 100,000 men and women made the trip up to the Yukon. A profound question. Here's an interesting thought. This is the first year I've brought questions back into lead statements. I'm going to try it out. Usually I tell the kids they can't use questions, and here's why. The only way a question works as a lead is if it's a profound question. A profound question is a question that will cause the reader to stop and go, man, I never thought of that. That's really interesting. But most students have a hard time coming up with profound questions. They ask questions like, do you want to be rich? Well, yeah. That's not a profound question. That's silly. Or, have you ever been to the Klondike? No. Those are not profound questions. So I'm going to see if we can bring questions back in, because I have seen over the years some students say, I'd really like to use this question, and they are really good. You can do a what if. What if you found yourself in the middle of nowhere, 20 below zero, with an empty pan instead of full of gold? You can play what ifs. That works out really well as a good lead. Or if you stumble across or run across a very little or unknown fact about what you are presenting in your paper, that makes a really good lead. So here's a whole bunch of suggestions on how to create good leads. Then what you need to do is you need to come up with the gist. But what is a gist? Does anybody remember from last year? Nate? Yeah, it's what your paper is going to be about. So you have to provide the reader with the gist of the essay. The reason we call it the gist and not the main idea is when we say the word main idea, we typically think of one sentence. But a gist is more, it's a bigger picture. It's 2 to 3 sentences. Can even be as many as 4. but you're not starting to provide the reader with a whole bunch of information at this point, and you're not giving the reader a bunch of facts that you have located. You're just painting that big picture so that I have a clear idea of what I'm going to be studying about or reading about in your essay. So basically what you're saying is, how can you sum up your information without providing specific details so the reader can get an idea of what's to come in the paper? Okay. The last sentence is to wrap it up. We've reached the end already of our introduction. Introductions are typically anywhere between 4 and 6 sentences long at this level. You get into college, university study, you could write introductions that are 2 pages. But we're not worried about that here. We're worried about getting down the basics. So we have to let our reader know exactly what the idea of this essay is about. And we call this a thesis statement. It transitions the reader into the rest of the essay. This is important to understand. You cannot leave one paragraph and go into the next without letting the reader know that we're moving. Okay? It's like when you're driving down the road and there's a sign that says curve ahead. Let the driver know the curve is coming. Same thing with the transition statement. A thesis must be specific and direct to the rest of the paper. In other words, if you don't address it in your thesis statement, it does not belong in your paper. So your thesis statement also has to be general enough to include everything you want to write about. So here's a sample thesis for this topic. While a few succeeded, many failed when thousands of men and women made the journey into the Klondike in search of gold. So I'm not going to write about the state bird of Alaska in my paper. I'm not going to write about the Iditarod because that's not what this paper is talking about. I'm not going to write about the fact that you can see Russia from the Klondike because that's not what this paper is about. This paper is all about what happened when men and women went up into the Klondike to look for gold, and what happened when they were there, and how they got there, and what they found, and who else went up to help them. That's what my thesis does for me. It tells me what's going to be in the paper. Okay? So introductions are pretty simple. They tell us exactly what's going to be in the paper, and it also interests us into reading it.